Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you, Figma, for having me. And it's just awesome to have so many designers in the same place at once. It's so rare that this happens. So thank you, everybody, as well, for being here. As Jacob mentioned, I'm Ethan. I lead design at Slack. I've been at Slack for about 4 years now. And first of all, I just want to get so I can kind of see out there, I just want to get a raise of hands. Who here uses Slack? Okay, a lot of you. Great. Okay, so you'll know what I'm talking about here. So today we're going to be talking about Slack's product principles, how we put them into practice, and how you can create product principles for your own companies. But before we get started, I just want to kick things off by asking a really important question, which is, what's the point of designing and building software? You know, there's many reasons to do this, right? Many reasons to make software. But the one that's meant most to me in my career is trying to create software that leads to something that customer love. And this is like really hard to do, but if you can make software that customers truly love, you've got a chance to make their lives just a bit better. And for me, that's always been a really good reason to get out of bed in the morning and do design. Even though I love design, I also want to be driven by something that's got a little bit more of a mission, and customer love is a really good mission. At Slack, we focus on building software that is simple, productive, and pleasant. And along the way, we've done some things well, and we always have room to improve. Yet through it all, we've aimed to craft a product that has a fighting chance of earning our customers' love by using a set of product principles that helps us make decisions every step of the way. And today, I'm here to share with you these principles and also provide you with a little bit of a roadmap for how you can put them into practice within your own organizations. Okay, so before we get started, let's take a quick look at how organizations work. Okay, first, this is what happens when you have an early organization. Team starts off small. It's just a few people, and so it's easy for them to all share the same perspective on what to build and how to build it. Oftentimes, there's a core leader, maybe it's a product leader, maybe it's the founder, maybe it's engineering leader or design leader that is leading the way in terms of helping people understand how to build product in the best way possible. In any case, the team is small, and so it's easy for people to make fast decisions. And the team is really productive, and so they make something that people want, in fact, love, and that little Zelda customer meter is all the way full, okay? And then they add people, right? Because they're successful. People start using their product more. And each of these new people comes to the team with their own past experiences, their own imprint of what it means to design and build great product. And some of these ideas work really well within the current way of building product, and some of them might conflict. So you start to see a little bit of beginnings of misalignment. But the product is doing well, and so more people are added to the team, but that little customer meter just goes down by a point. And the more people who are added, the more new perspectives, the more misalignment, and it's easy to see where this is all going. Soon you've got a growing organization that isn't moving forward as swiftly as it should. Decision-making is confusing. Teams have a hard time of making correct, independent decisions. And it's all because they lack an agreed-upon way of working. It's like everyone in the organization is playing sports, but they can't decide which one. Some are playing football, some are playing basketball, others are playing soccer. They all know they need to put the ball in the goal, but the way to do it is it's all over the place. And this is where product principles come into play. Product principles can help teams provide a common rule set for how people play the game of product development. They make sure that everyone is on the same page, on the same team, playing the same game, in the same style. Okay, so product principles. First, what are they? Well, in short, they're a set of fundamental propositions for how a product should, and importantly, shouldn't be designed and built. And fundamental is important here. You shouldn't have 15 product principles. People can't keep those in their heads when they're making decisions. You should have between 3 and 5 so that if people have a question about where to go next, they can immediately remember the product principles. Next, who are they for? Well, they're for everyone who contributes to building your product. That includes designers, product managers, engineers, researchers, data scientists, product specialists, product marketing managers. We're not just talking about design principles here. We're talking about holistic product principles. At Slack, I've even shared these product principles with our sales team, and they love them. They say, this is actually very philosophically how we're oriented too. This is great. We can use these for our team. So then why should you have product principles? Well, at this point, it should be easy for you to know because we have them. We need to align people. And everybody comes to the product with different perspectives. And the principles ensure this good level of alignment across everyone, which then makes it easier for teams to make decisions. And that goes for your internal teams that are working on features together when they're making decisions internally. And it goes for aligning decisions up and down your leadership chain, especially at larger organizations. In fact, at Slack, the principles were really established by Stuart Butterfield, our former CEO. And so the principles kind of provide this cheat code for how to have a good product review with Stuart. If you use the principles, it oftentimes worked really well because he was really involved in the product and he really cared about it and making product decisions along the way. Having those principles as a guide was really useful for folks. Okay, when should you use them? Well, it really depends on your team. I would say at Slack, we use them when we think about product strategy, when we're doing yearly or quarterly planning. We use them when we're executing, when teams are working on features and making decisions about what to do next. And then we also use them when making decisions on whether a product is a good enough quality to go out the door to our customers. That all said, we probably use them the most in that execution phase where teams are coming together and trying to determine where to go next. And then lastly, the question is, how should the principles be used? Well, my suggestion for this is simple. You should use them as much as possible. The more you and others use these principles to guide your decisions, the more comfortable you'll become with them. The more you can debate them, the more you can explore them, the more you can question them. You know, at Slack, I try to use these principles when I provide my team with design feedback so that people on the team understand that we're making a principle-based design decision, and also they become more comfortable using the principles themselves. We also do this on the product side as well. Okay, so with that context set, let's actually dive into the product principles themselves so you can get a better feel for how Slack has used our product principles to guide our product decision making, orienting ourselves towards customer love. So here's our product principles. Don't make me think, be a great host, prototype the path, seek the steepest part of the utility curve, and take bigger, bolder bets. All right, so a few notes on these principles. Some of these are very design-focused, and some of them are actually very product-focused. And there's one, the one right in the middle, is actually pretty engineering-focused, and this is by design. At Slack, we want everybody, regardless of function, to care about these holistic product principles. And oftentimes at Slack, we sort of blur the lines between roles, too. Another note on these principles. These are principles that are made for Slack. It's customers and what we know is best for them. By the way, I'm going to use the term customer today because Slack sells a product, so we have customers. You might use the term users for your product. You might have other terms that you call your customers or users, but I'm going to call them customers today. So your company's principles may be similar to Slack's, or they may be different. And the orientation of your principles is really up to you and should be based on your understanding of what generates customer love. And we'll get a little bit more into that near the end of the presentation. Okay, so to illustrate how these principles came to be, it's worthwhile for us to touch base on the history of the principles. So Slack was and is fortunate to have a CEO in Stuart Butterfield, former CEO, who is just an extraordinary product and design thinker. You know, that was what he cared the most about. It was really about the product and the design and creating a great customer experience. And Stuart is also a philosopher by training, so he has this naturally principled way of thinking about the world. Yet he's also an incredibly original thinker, which meant that he would oftentimes use his product principles when meeting with teams, but he would frame them in unique ways or speak of them in slightly different terms. And that had a tendency to confuse teams because they were hearing slightly different but slightly similar feedback. And so one of the jobs that I had at Slack when I joined early on was I sat down with Stuart and Tamar, our CPO at the time, my former boss, and she may be out here, she's also at Config, and Cal, our CTO, and we iteratively refined Stuart's principles into a common language solid enough to stick. And that's what we did. We spent 2 months iterating on the principles, the tactics used to support them, and examples to bring them home for people. And this was critically important for Slack, especially as it was in its growing period, and as we brought more talented people into the organization, people who might have worked at, say, like Google or Facebook or Instagram, companies with entirely different business models and entirely different user goals than Slack. Again, Slack is a tool for work. It's not free. People need to learn how to use it. It's actually somewhat complicated. We're not interested in conversion or engagement as a means to drive the business. And so as we grew and we brought new people in that maybe came from companies that did, the principles really helped align us all. And we continue to use these principles today to help align us. Okay, so that's kind of the backstory here. So with that in place, let's actually walk through the principles themselves. So we'll start with don't make me think. Okay, so nobody in the history of the world and in the history of software has woken up in the morning and said, oh, I want to learn a new piece of software today. Instead, they woke up in the morning and think, I've got a bunch of tough problems to solve. Like, maybe I might find some software that will help me solve those problems. Hopefully don't think about that in the morning either. But the fact is that Slack is a relatively complex tool. It's got a lot of features in it. And so our goal at Slack is to really think about every step within that customer journey. Every step, how can we make that step as understandable as possible? Because every screen that people are reading, they need to comprehend and understand until they get to the next step, and the next step, and the next step. And over time, going through each of those steps, and sometimes you just look at the click path that you have when you're actually building a product, there's a lot of points and a lot of steps people have to go through. But we're building up knowledge of the product over those steps, breaking it down to simple bits so that by the time people are in Slack, hopefully they're up and running and they understand it. And the other ways that we can do that is provide similar patterns so they don't have to relearn software altogether. So here's some tactics that bring this all to life. So the first is have a clear information hierarchy. So every step of the way, make sure that you've got clear information hierarchy. This seems very obvious, very design-centered, but it's really sometimes hard to do. We also think about the notion of cognitive calories. In every dialogue or every step of the way, how many distinct concepts does a customer need to understand in order to comprehend that specific step? And let's bring it down to the bare minimum so they can get through that step and hopefully get to the next step. We also think about information hierarchy at the top level of our app. If every function is at the top level of the app, nothing is particularly important. It's going to make it a lot more complicated for people to comprehend. And that relates actually to the third point here, which is that more clicks are okay. In other words, if we're removing some items from the top level UI, it means that a lot of that functionality needs to live a few clicks down the path, and that's actually okay, because when people are able to find what they're looking for, and that thing that they're looking for delivers value, they develop this mental path because they've got a little dopamine release after going down the path, giving them the reward that the feature worked. They'll remember where it was in the first place. We also only change standards if they're 10 times better. We have a design system. It's called Slack It. We ask our designers to embrace and extend it. And we also look at like the controls that our operating system gives us. And the OS is actually innovating in a really fast pace today. So we try to encourage designers and engineers in the teams to not be too clever around innovating in this space and instead leverage existing components, because our customers don't need to learn new things if they're using common components. And the last one's really important. It's about building comprehension over removing friction. You know, we're not, again, creating an e-commerce experience. We're trying to create an experience that people can understand. So what's important here is that people actually comprehend each step before they get to the next one. Okay, here's some examples of this. This is Slack's onboarding flow. We've been working on this particular flow for around 3 years now, something like that, 2 or 3 years. And we use something called progressive disclosure in this flow. So when people come to Slack, we ask them first, you know, what is your workspace? But we don't show them the entire interface. That you're actually looking at the existing interface for new customers. And then we ask them to add people to their team at Slack so that they can get started collaborating, because they know that's critically important. And then we ask them to say, you know, what kind of project are you working on? We don't call it a channel, even that's what they're creating, because that's too complicated to understand at that point in the process. Once we get the name of the project, then we tell them, hey, congratulations, you've created a channel. And we give them some, you know, nice little coach mark that makes them feel happy. And then we get them into the conversation by then providing these in-context tooltips that then help people invite others so they can actually have the conversation. So we're progressively getting them into the product, learning each step of the way here. Another example is the improvements to our channel header. So when I started in 2019, there was around 16 different icons at the top level of the header. Some of these were actually inscrutable icons, and we had duplicates, like 2 stars. What does that even mean? So we put a lot of effort into this, and we actually significantly reduced the number of icons over time until where we're at today, which is really just the channel name and then the count of how many people are in the channel or in the conversation. Now, clicking anywhere on this header opens up what is the channel details dialog. And that details dialog has multiple tabs. It's got a lot of information and control in it. But again, we hid that information one step away from the top level. This can be challenging to accomplish because especially in growing teams, right, when you have a successful product, because every team is going to want to put their icon at the top level to get it more usage and more visibility. And it's critically important for you to fight against this and try to create a simple experience for your customers. I guarantee you they will appreciate it. Okay, next up is the sidebar redesign. This one's relatively sort of lightweight, but it's had a pretty big impact. We did a few little changes here in response to customers saying, hey, Slack is overwhelming to me. And by the way, just redesign the sidebar is not enough. We've got some really great things coming up that are going to help you with any overwhelming feelings you might have using Slack, if you actually have those feelings. So trust me, this isn't it. But what we did here is we essentially changed some of the typography. We spaced out our section headers. We changed the type sizes for the actual name of the section header. And then we changed the color red, which is actually pretty aggressive. We changed it to white. And that just like calmed things down just a little bit, made people think just a little bit less harder. Sometimes it's the subtle things that really matter. OK, the next principle is be a great host. So simply building a great product isn't enough. As designers, I think we oftentimes think about ourselves as being incredibly empathetic. But it's really hard to dig super deep and think about what our customers need versus our ideas for what we might think is best for our customers. And this is just a real challenge that we all have, because we're the ones who are designing it. We've done a lot of research. We've talked with a lot of people. We've talked with our product managers. We think we have an idea of what they need to build. We also are thinking about the engineering constraints. We've got all this information in our heads. It becomes difficult for us to really get down to the core of what our customers need after all that work. So here's some tactics to do this. First, where we want to be clever is around ways to remove a step so that people can do their work faster. I think this is actually one of the promises of AI. If you look at what AI does, it basically takes the process of using software, almost any software, which is essentially a series of clicks. Think about how you use Figma. Click, 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 like hundreds of thousands of clicks over your lifetime of using Figma, right? It's all just clicks. Plus, I have to learn where that thing is, learn where that thing is, learn where that thing goes. That's how all software works. You have to learn, and then you click, click, click. What AI does is you just basically say, I want to do something. Type, intent, and then boom, it's done. That's what's so magical about it. Now, there's different ways that we can do this in Slack outside of AI, and we really always seek to try to do that. Here's an example. It's like when you copy a link, and then you paste it on, and you select some text in the message, then you paste it. It just pastes the link. You know, I wish Gmail would do that. It just makes sense. It saves people a step. It's super convenient. We consider all users and how they work. We optimize for screen readers. We think about our developers and our admins. Oftentimes, we have multiple perspectives we need to think about with our customers. We put effort into the last mile. We really encourage our product teams, in fact, sometimes we demand it, to not release a feature until it's done. I was just talking with a Slack product manager about the time that we released new message compose. And they waited 2 months after the deadline, the actual timeline that they put out there, that they said they release it internally to the company, because it wasn't done yet. And that was entirely OK, because the goal was to release something that was good, not to hit a deadline. But if we do release something that needs some work, because sometimes we will do that, we need teams to commit to just cleaning it up and making sure that it is excellent in a fast follow release. Then the last one is called avoiding the owner's delusion. This one's really important. It's also really hard to do. Owner's delusion is what happens. It's the bias that occurs when we think we know what's best for our customers. And oftentimes we have good reason to think we know what's best for them, because we spend a lot of time with them. We think about them all the time. It's really hard for us to strip away all our preconceived notions and just look at the software from a new user and a fresh perspective. And that's critically important to do, because I just see this day in and day out. If you take, and it's really hard to do, if you just kind of take this beginner's mind and look at the software anew without any of your preconceived notions of it, oftentimes you'll find that there's a lot of differences in perspective versus your normal perspective. And this is really important to try to do as much as you can. And when you do it, don't use performance-enhancing psychedelics. That doesn't work. OK. The next one is, the example is unread channels and mentions. OK, so this one is where we really want to be a good host on mobile versus desktop. OK? So mobile works in a different way than desktop at Slack. At Slack, you basically have your unreads and mentions all sort of through your sidebar. But in mobile, we bubble these all up to the top level, right? Because we know that on mobile, people are there to triage primarily. So we want to make sure all of that important information is up at the top of Slack, immediately accessible without even needing to swipe. So it's a big difference between mobile and desktop. We didn't want to have consistency there. Another one is add to MPDM, which is our internal way we talk about multi-person direct messages. So you probably had this experience like a few months ago where you tried to add somebody to a direct message and you weren't able to. And you're like, why doesn't Slack allow me to do this? Well, it's because we had prioritized other things before this, but we should have actually just prioritized this one because it was so common. It was such a common need. So basically, we just built it, and that was the right thing to do. The next one is Reactive Solidarity. I think this is actually one of the best features and best designs that I've ever experienced in my career. And the reason why is because what the feature does is it essentially accomplishes a feeling of solidarity and unity within the organization. And the way it works is basically when people react with a hue of emoji, then it will combine all of those similar emojis together into one solid reactee that is it's basically a consistent set of all of the different hues all combined together. And so this feature was actually developed in the wake of George Floyd's murder and a lot of the riots and revolts that came as a response to that and a lot of the unrest that was going on. And the goal here was actually to try to bring teams together just a little bit and try to do that through software. And so we got some feedback from folks that this actually did create a level of solidarity within their organization. We felt that at Slack as well. So Pedro worked on this. I want to give a shout out to Pedro on this design. It was a really great one. He's in the front row here. Another way that we've tried to be good hosts is with profile card celebration. So Slack is an enterprise product. It's built for teams to do work. And nobody really asked us to put little animations and illustrations on the birthday and anniversary cards, but it's like a nice thing to do. And when others see that within your organization, they're able to give people a humanistic kind of compliment, even though we're working remotely. And it's just a kind of a nice thing to do. So we put some effort into doing this, and again, teams have responded really positively to that. And a lot of teams have actually asked us, let us create our own custom events because we want to leverage this and celebrate people a bit more within their organizations. Okay, last one here is not actually a Slack example, but this one is just so good. You've probably experienced this if you stayed in an Airbnb. But basically, when somebody logs onto a Wi-Fi network that other people aren't on, then a next person who tries to log onto that network, it basically creates a little push notification or this little box that slides up from the bottom for the person who's already on. It allows them to get the other people onto the network. So it makes that person who granted access to the network like the hero for the next 5 minutes. And that's such a cool experience. When does software actually make you feel like a hero with your group of friends? Again, this is really hard software to build. It's really hard design to do. I think this is the height of interaction design, when you can actually help people feel better about themselves via the way that the design works. Okay, so next principle, and this is actually, I think, one of the most important principles, is prototype the path. As Jacob mentioned, I've worked across a lot of companies, and I think Slack prototypes the path better than any place that I've worked at, and I want to give you a little insight into how we do it. So first of all, Slack is this living, breathing information organism, and it's an information ecosystem. It's used by so many different teams across the world in so many different contexts. We can't presume to know how the features we build for Slack will be used by our customers. And so we try to move from having an idea to actually executing in a live build as quickly as possible, because the only way we can get to the truth of the matter is by actually experiencing a prototype of the thing that we have an idea about. And if we don't have that, the time that we're spending debating the thing that somebody wrote about, it isn't necessarily wasted time, but it's also not super valuable time, especially if you want to make a decision on what's right and what's wrong. Okay, so some tactics here. First, prototypes are questions. They're not answers. It's important for your team to have hypotheses that you actually want to test. You have to have really good hypotheses. And then you figure out the answer to that hypothesis through the process of prototyping. Now, part of doing this is by creating quick and dirty prototypes as quickly as possible. And this principle is actually more related to engineers than designers or product managers, because we ask engineers at Slack to actually create quick and dirty prototypes and also feel good throwing away code. And that could be really challenging for folks, because oftentimes their career ladders are based on them shipping live code versus building prototypes and throwing them away. But what we try to do at Slack is then incentivize our developers and our engineers in a different way. And then lastly, we talk about getting to the next hill. So basically, each prototype, you have a hypothesis, you build a prototype, then you test it with your customers, and then you learn from it, and now you're at the next hill. And you get a different vantage point. Then you can develop new hypotheses because you now have made progress into the future, and you get to the next hill. And you keep on doing that as you move forward. And the process of prototyping essentially gives you all of these new learnings, all of these new vantage points to develop new hypotheses. The Slack that you're using today I consider that to be a widely shipped prototype, because I know we're going to change it into the future as we learn new things about the way that our customers use the product. That's like fundamental to the way that we work. Okay, so here's some more diagrammatic examples of how I think about prototyping. So on the one end, you've got something like a written description, right? It can be effective in articulating where you want to go with your feature or product, but it doesn't really align people that well because everybody's got a different mental model of what you've written. Now, the other thing, though, is it's actually pretty cheap to write out a document with ideas in it. Now, as you move up this spectrum of fidelity, typically things get more expensive. And when you go from wireframe to high-res design, whether that's a static design or something that's made with like a Figma prototype, that's still moving up the chain until you get to a live data design. It's actually a design that's powered with live data. That's a really great way to directly align people, have a debate. But unfortunately, in many organizations, this actually costs a lot more, unless you can cultivate an engineering team that feels good throwing away code so they can do this kind of work a lot faster. Or you might consider hiring design engineers. That's a really great thing for design engineers to help teams with. We also talk a lot about Slack as design being the squiggly line. You've probably heard this before, but we kind of have a unique interpretation of it. So when we're prototyping, what we will oftentimes do is we'll prototype product directions that we know probably won't work. But we want to explore them because we want to explore the sort of the edges of the hypotheses, the edges of the probable. And we'll get insights because we know pushing it in this direction actually works for these reasons and doesn't for these reasons. And then we'll go to the other side. And then we'll get towards ideas that are a little bit more in the middle that we think are a little bit more realistic. But we'll oftentimes spend engineering resources and time and designer energy focusing on some of these like more divergent directions in live code so that we can get a better idea after we go through the process of what actually works. And in fact, sometimes we go through this process and we end up back where we started, but we end up back where we started, the beginning, with a much better idea of the spectrum of possibilities and also why the idea that we have is the right one. Because we've failed so many times and we've learned from those failures. We've learned what has been successful as well. So this can sometimes be exhausting to the team. And I just want to acknowledge that for folks at Slack who have done this before. It can be really exhausting. But what's great is that when you release products like this, you actually have a fairly complete idea of what will work for your customers and what doesn't work, and you'll be prepared for it. Because no design is ever going to be successful 100% of the time for 100% of people. The best we can do is have almost perfect understanding of what works and what doesn't. Okay, so 2 important books. First one is Creative Selection. Who's read this book? Oh my goodness, there needs to be more hands. Okay. Read this book. This is a fantastic book. It's about the main story, and it is about the development of the iPhone keyboard. And there's no way that a designer could have done that in static design or even like some kind of animated prototype or clickable prototype. Ken Kosienda, who is the lead engineer on that, talks about his journey sort of building and prototyping that. He's now one of the lead engineers at Humane. And then Sketching User Interfaces. Anybody read this book? This is an oldie, but a really good one. So this is a book that I read way back in the day. It's super inspirational for me. It talks about the full spectrum of different types of prototype, physical prototyping, as well as digital prototyping. It's super fundamental. Highly recommend this book. Okay, so here's some examples around prototyping the path that we've done at Slack. So this is Information Architecture 1.0. We did this about 3 years ago. It was a pretty holistic redesign of Slack. And what you're seeing here is 3 different versions of Slack. Okay, the different versions of the sidebar, of where search is located. We had an engineer on the team, Kyle, build out each one of these versions. And then the core team that was working on this project all worked in these versions live for about 2 weeks. And after we were done with that 2-week session, we then got together and we talked about it. We called it tasting the soup, where we're all basically actually tasting the soup. And we're saying, well, add a little pepper here, add a little salt here. And we decided on one primary direction. We couldn't have got there unless we actually lived in these prototypes. And getting back to that design squiggly path, one of the prototypes, one of the directions we knew, like, that probably wouldn't work, but the information we gained from that direction was actually really foundational in terms of the final product. Okay, another example here is Huddles co-working. This is another example of just iterating on the interaction design for how you enter into a Huddles conversation. This is an audio-only Huddles conversation. The team went through so many rounds of working on this. And then the last example here is clips. So right now in Slack, you can create audio or video clips that you can then share in line in a conversation. But some of our original builds, not just design, but the engineers built this, was basically this like stories-like feature on the top of the channel. And it was pretty cool. It was pretty cool to be able to play with this. And it actually created a lot of good infrastructure for the engineering teams to like be a little bit more flexible. But what we learned from actually building this and playing with this is that the frequency of posting video clips wasn't so high to warrant a UI like this. And so the team pivoted away from this, and now we just simply post clips into the channel in line, and it works a lot better. Okay, so that's the engineering-oriented principle. Now we're getting into some of the more like product-oriented principles, but I think these are really important for designers to think about as well. So at Slack, we talk about hitting the steepest part of the utility curve when we're focusing on what to build, okay? And so this is a visualization of the utility curve. I just want to say, we talk about this a lot. I have a hunch that Figma kind of uses philosophies like this because they always seem to launch features that meet real needs for all of us. And they're really good at saying probably no to some things to focus all their energy on other things like variables and prototyping. So the way the utility curve works is that you put a lot of effort into a product, okay, or a feature, and you go along this line and you're putting a lot of effort into it, and customers and users just don't see the value. And then you start pulling up the curve and you get past this oh no point, and you start going up the curve until you put a little bit more effort to it and you get to a really high part of that curve and you hit this like amazing point of value. But once you go past that point, any more effort you put into it, you're actually not going to get much more customer value. So it probably makes sense to stop working on the feature so much anymore. So that's how utility curve works. And it can be really challenging to know where you're at within that curve, especially when you're in that beginning line. That beginning line might actually last a lot longer than you might expect. And it's really easy to become discouraged, especially if you're prototyping the path along that flat line. Like, okay, when are we going to actually hit product market fit? When are people actually going to understand the way that this works and is working for them? So that can be kind of a slog, and you need to have faith sometimes. And then the dotted lines represent the pace of progress as we move into the future. So 6 months ago, AI wasn't really a thing. Yeah, I'm always confusing AI and IA. So AI wasn't a thing. And so people had this different conception of the way that products should work. And now almost every single product has to be about AI and automation somehow. What it's done is it's shifted the utility curve forward for everybody. So now if your product actually doesn't respond to that, you're back. And what used to be useful to your customers 6 months ago is no longer useful. So it's important to pay attention to this. That curve is not static. It's always moving forward in time. Okay, so here are some tactics to make sure that you're hitting the steepest part of that curve. The first two are kind of similar. So the first one is if it's great, it doesn't need to be good. This is really about focus, right? There's only a few number of things that if you focus on will make your product absolutely great. So with Gmail, way back in the day, it was just this unlimited amount of storage. That was unheard of in email at the time. That was like the killer thing they had to get right. At Slack, we also talk about basically identifying our habitable planets. In the solar system, there's only one planet we know of that sustains life. It's Earth. We should really focus on this one. Likewise, there's only 1 or 2 major features you can work on at a time that are going to help your customers the most. And the critical thing is identifying which ones those are. We also talk about balancing your efforts. You know, it's really easy to stop before you hit that steep part of the utility curve. And it's also easy to go over the utility curve. So it's important to really think about when you're right in the middle. And it doesn't require a product manager to identify this. As designers, you should have an instinct for where you are as well within that curve. And the last one I think is really important. It's to think about, and it's related to the first two as well. One of the ways to think about the most important thing to focus on for your customers is where, when you do innovate, you can get back nonlinear results. Okay, like what kind of feature could you build that could unleash an entire opportunity for new sort of product development, new paths for your product to take, new, like brand new sets of functionality and value for your customers. And from a designer's perspective, it's important to think about this when you think about getting a product requirement, like here's what we want to build. Just fulfilling the spec isn't actually enough. It's important to go beyond that and try to come up with design ideas that actually take your customers in new directions, that provide a level of innovation in the design that unlocks a whole new set of opportunities for your customers, a whole new sort of path for design for them. Okay, so here's some examples. Slack.com homepage. This is the way the homepage looks today. And the team, though, was working on this homepage was told, okay, you can't really innovate on the homepage because it's optimized for performance. And if you innovate on it, you're probably going to have fewer teams that actually join Slack down the chain. And so the team worked on this page. They did a really good job of updating the page, and they got to the point where it was like statistically neutral. And then they were in an executive review with our CTO, Cal, and Cal basically said, okay, you've got it to a neutral spot, but I think if you just put a little bit more effort into this, you can actually make the page perform better. The team said, oh gosh, we've been working on this for over a year. Okay, we'll give it one more quarter. And so they went back and they redesigned the page. They included animation and motion. They improved the copy, and they significantly improved the metrics. So that was a case where one of the executives said, you're not at the steep part of the utility curve. Push a little bit harder, and you can get there. Another one is huddles. So when we launched huddles, it was audio only first. This is a time when people were getting a lot of Zoom fatigue. And so the team made a decision. We're not going to launch video huddles. We're just going to focus on audio and do that really well. And they did. It was the fastest growing feature at Slack. They made a really good principled decision to focus on creating a great experience for huddles. I don't know if you all remember this, but when they launched it, there was this little elevator music that would come on if you were waiting. That was just a little sweet touch. It was a focus on being a great host, but the team had time to put care and love into the feature because they were so principled around where they wanted to scope it. Okay, last principle is take bigger, bolder bets. This one is really about sort of setting your sights to make a much better product and not being satisfied with where you're at. What can oftentimes happen is when your product gets success, you start to grow, and you start then to optimize for features that are on the margins of making an impact. And so it's important to always think about moving forward in bigger and bolder ways. So some ways we do this at Slack is we always have a vision. We think about where we're headed over the next 3, 6 months, maybe a year, 3 years out, and we try to track towards that, even while we get to the next hill over time. We're data informed, we're not data driven. So we think about data from different perspectives: qualitative, quantitative, metrics-based, the way that we use it internally, the way that our customers use it. We oftentimes share builds in Slack Connect with our customers. We get all that information together, and then we ask our product teams to make their own decisions based on that data versus saying, okay, customer told us this, so then we're going to do this. That doesn't really work. We have to be data informed, not data driven. It's important to be flexible as well. So, even though we may be looking at taking a bigger, bolder bet, if we have an opportunity to solve a problem for somebody that's small and get to the next hill, we'll do that too. And then this one's super critical. And this is critical, I think, especially for folks who may be working on enterprise products out there. So every change that you make to your software is going to irritate your customers and your users. Like, that's basically a truism in all of design. If you make any changes to your interface, some people will be upset. Now, what can happen is that companies and teams get in this mindset that they're focusing on optimizing for minimizing downside versus optimizing for maximizing the upside for new and existing users. And so they just don't innovate. They don't move their interface forward. And I think that's like the death knell for your experience, because then you're going to calcify. Your customers may not complain, but you're also not giving them the best experience, and you're not driving towards that bold new vision. So keep that in mind when your product managers say, no, we can't do this because it's going to irritate our customers. Like, it's always important to push forward. And instead of minimizing downside, really optimize the upside for new and existing users. So some ways that we've done this is the team that was working on mobile and iPad said, okay, Slack works this way on desktop, but we think we can create a much better experience for the iPad interface. It hasn't been touched in the last 4 years, and they took a really big, meaningful step forward, redesigned the entire experience and launched it, and it performed extraordinarily well. And it really performed better than the other experience, but it was a very big, bold step that taught our team a lot of lessons. Another one is the Composer redesign. This seems kind of small, but Slack Composer used to have a lot of icons in it, and it was challenging to winnow that set down. Again, don't make people think. We winnowed that down to the most essential set, and then you can access other functions from clicking those icons. But the Composer is the most important piece of Slack's interface, so anything we do to it is actually like fraught with challenges. This team worked really hard, got it out the door. And then the last one that I want to show you is Huddles Polish. So when we decided to launch video huddles, the team that worked on it again put a lot of love and care into the last mile. So we had our design engineers focusing on how to make the windows a bit more animated and between transition states. We hired artists to create background illustrations and also audio when you're on pause or having a collaboration session. And then we create animated reacties that pop up. You can have, like little love bubbles that fly up, or there's one blue animated dolphin that I would highly recommend engaging with when you can. But these are all things to make the product feel more fun and alive and feel more Slacky and Slack-like. But the team wanted to put the effort into doing this. And we consider this actually not just great for being a great host, but also a real tribute to like pushing and making a bigger, bolder bet and doing this kind of work. Okay. So we've talked through Slack's product principles, our tactics, and we've seen examples of them in practice. And hopefully this provides you with a good understanding of the principles that we use at Slack to guide our decisions around when you think about strategy and execution and then what we ship. Okay, so let's talk about how these principles can apply to you in your own practice and your own teams. So the first step for the principles for you is to just start. Don't wait to start them. Every team should have principles established as soon as possible. And the reason it's important is because it's really important to have a clearly articulated and principled approach to making consistent decisions, fundamentally. It's just the healthy thing to do. And here's the thing, if you're prototyping the path, once you establish your principles, you can always change them as you learn new things. That's the art of prototyping the path. The second is to involve people who make final decisions, right? If you're the one who's tasked, your job is to actually establish the principles. Don't just establish them for the design team. Establish them for the entire product team and establish them in a way and in involvement with the people who are making the final decisions. Because if they're enrolled, then they're going to bring the entire organization along with them. Next, when you think about establishing the principles, think about how to define good ones. And the way to do this is to really work backwards from what works. What do customers love about your product? What decisions have you made that have led to customer love? What products do you love and why do you love them? Bring all that into play. While these principles may seem philosophical, the best principles are actually anthropological. In other words, they're defined by seeing what works in practice, not from postulating about what might work in theory. Okay, also use examples. Again, getting back to that prototyping page, words only get you so far. People can be misaligned around words. It's always important to use examples along with your principles, whether they're internal examples or external examples. Always make sure you have examples. Then next, launch a perpetual propaganda campaign. This is especially important when your organizations are larger. You need to get everybody on the same page around the principles. When we did principles at Slack, I met with teams, individual teams. I met with larger teams. I presented in front of the company at all hands. We printed out these massive posters and we put them in every elevator exit at Slack so that when it was unavoidable, you had to actually see the principles. We had OKRs where we basically were measuring how effective the principles were in practice. We asked our product leaders to use them in every review. We printed out stickers. It was literally an internal propaganda campaign. You could not avoid the product principles. And then we kept on. We kept on doing this. And every new hire that joins Slack today, I do a session for them where we talk about the product principles. And that's the kind of effort that needs to go into making sure that they're sustained and that they're actually utilized and that they actually work. Otherwise, they'll just kind of fade away. Okay, lastly, prototype the path with your principles. So the Slack principles that we reviewed today are actually our second iteration. After 3 years after our first iteration, we took a step back, we observed what was working and what wasn't, the behavior of the product and the design teams, what was new in the world and new with our customers, and we revised the principles. So these are fresh, new principles. They're about 5 months old now, but they work for this day and age, and I can guarantee you in another year, another 2 years, we're going to have new updates to the principles. Okay. So there you have it. This is the secret sauce recipe for establishing product principles for your own team. And as the next step, I just want to encourage you all to take the information that we've discussed today and then jump into number one. Step number one, don't wait and do it now. And if you have any questions for me about the principles, I can be reached here on Twitter or LinkedIn. And thank you very much.